The air in Harmony Creek had a weight to it that day, a heavy, damp stillness that promised violence. Eleanor Vance, known to the few who still spoke to her as Ellie, felt it in her bones. It was the same ache she'd felt the morning her husband, John, had taken his last breath, leaving her with nothing but a 30-acre farm and a mountain of debt. She stood on her porch, a faded floral dress hanging loosely on her frame, and watched the sky. The clouds on the horizon weren't white and fluffy. They were the color of a bad bruise, a sickly greenish-black that swallowed the blue of the afternoon. The bank's letter, crisp and cruel, felt like a lead weight in her apron pocket. 30 days. 30 days before the life she and John had built would be sold on the courthouse steps to the highest bidder. Mr. Gable, the town banker with eyes as cold and small as pebbles, had made that perfectly clear. He'd looked at her with a mix of pity and impatience, as if her grief were a personal inconvenience to his ledgers. Pride was a stubborn thing, though. It was the only crop that still grew on her land. It was in the neat rows of wilting tomatoes she tended by hand, in the polished glass of the windows on a house that was no longer truly hers, in the determined set of her jaw as she faced each sunrise alone. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She wouldn't let them see the tears that fell only after the lamp was out, when she traced the outline of John's face in the silver frame on her nightstand. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that rustled the dry leaves of the cottonwood tree. It was an unnatural sound, a prelude to something terrible. Then, cutting through the eerie silence, came the wail of the tornado siren from town. It was a sound that turned blood to ice water. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her resolve. She grabbed the old wooden box containing John's papers and their wedding photograph and ran for the storm cellar. The cellar doors were heavy, weathered planks set into a small hill a dozen yards from the back door. As she struggled with the bolt, her hair whipping across her face, she saw him, a lone rider, fighting a spooked horse at the edge of her property line. The horse reared, its eyes wide with terror, and the man was thrown, landing hard on the ground. He was a stranger, dressed in the worn denim and dusty boots of a ranch hand. He wasn't moving. For a heartbeat, Ellie hesitated. The siren screamed its urgent warning. The sky was darkening by the second. Her own safety, her own survival was all that should have mattered. But then she saw the man stir, trying to push himself up, and she saw the dark stain spreading on his pant leg. John's voice echoed in her memory, as clear as if he were standing beside her. "You don't leave a man behind, Ellie. Not ever." With a cry that was swallowed by the wind, she ran. The air was thick with dirt and debris, stinging her eyes. "Get up!" she yelled, her voice thin against the growing roar. "The cellar! Over here!" He looked up, his face etched with pain, a gash bleeding freely on his forehead. He was lean but strong, his eyes a startlingly clear blue even in the gloom. He gritted his teeth and, using his horse's reins for support, staggered to his feet. She grabbed his arm, and together they half ran, half limped toward the shelter. The wind was a physical force now, trying to tear them apart. The roar was deafening, like 1,000 freight trains bearing down on their tiny plot of land. They tumbled down the cellar steps just as she managed to pull the heavy doors shut, dropping the thick wooden bar into place. Darkness enveloped them, the world outside reduced to a terrifying symphony of destruction. Inside the small, earthen-smelling space, there was only the sound of their own ragged breaths and the thunderous violence above them, with splintered, glass shattered, and a terrifying, grinding noise told Ellie that something large and essential was being torn from its foundation. She lit an old kerosene lamp with trembling hands, the small flame casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The stranger had slumped against a pile of old potato sacks, his face pale. She saw his leg was bleeding more heavily now. Without a word, she tore a strip from an old cotton sheet she kept for rags, kneeling beside him. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. He winced as she tied the makeshift bandage tightly above the wound. He didn't say anything, just watched her with those intense blue eyes. They were the eyes of a man who saw more than he spoke, who listened to the silence between words. She sat on an old crate opposite him, the lamp between them. She clutched the box of her memories to her chest, the only thing she had managed to save. She didn't ask his name and he didn't offer it. In the suffocating confines of the cellar, they were just two souls hiding from the wrath of the sky. He had the weathered look of a man who spent his life outdoors, his hands calloused and capable. He looked like 1,000 other men who worked the land, men who were as much a part of the landscape as the dust and the sun. He was nobody special, just a drifter caught in a storm. Yet, there was a quiet dignity about him, a stillness that seemed at odds with the chaos that had thrown them together. When the roaring finally began to recede, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the drip of water from somewhere above, he spoke for the first time. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges. "You saved my life," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Ellie just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "You ran into the storm for a stranger. When they finally pushed open the doors, the world was gone. The sun was breaking through the bruised clouds, casting a strange, golden light on a scene of total devastation. The barn, her beautiful red barn that John had built with his own 2 hands, was a pile of splintered lumber. The chicken coop had vanished. The ancient cottonwood tree was stripped bare, its branches twisted into grotesque shapes. And the house. The roof was half gone, the windows blown out, the porch ripped away. Ellie felt the last of her strength leave her. A sob escaped her, raw and painful. Everything was gone. The bank wouldn't even have to foreclose now. The tornado had done its job for them. She sank to her knees in the mud and debris, the letter in her pocket a sodden, meaningless scrap. The stranger stood beside her, his silhouette framed against the ruined landscape. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just stood there, a silent, solid presence in the wreckage of her life. After a long moment, he limped over to what was left of her fence line and picked up a broken post. "This will need mending first," he said, his voice practical. "Need to keep what's left of your stock from wandering." Ellie looked up, her eyes blurred with tears. He was just a stranger. He owed her nothing. But as she watched him start the slow, painstaking work of trying to bring order to the chaos, a tiny, fragile seed of hope, one she thought had died with John, began to stir in her heart. She didn't know it then, but the storm that had taken everything from her had also delivered the one man who could give it all back, and more. For now, he was just a cowboy with a bad leg and kind eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't entirely alone. The days that followed blurred into a routine of exhausting work and quiet companionship. The stranger, who told her to call him Silas, never spoke of leaving. He moved with a quiet efficiency that amazed Ellie. Despite his limp, he worked from sunup to sundown, his silence more comforting than the empty platitudes offered by the few neighbors who stopped by to survey the damage before quickly driving away. He mended fences, salvaged what lumber he could from the barn to patch the roof, and even managed to coax her terrified milk cow out of the woods. They ate their meals on the one remaining porch step, simple affairs of canned beans and bread. In the evenings, he would sit and clean his saddle leather while she mended their torn clothes by lamplight. He asked about John, not in a prying way, but with a genuine interest that made it easy for Ellie to talk about him. She told Silas about John's laugh, about his dream of buying the adjacent pasture, about the way he could fix any engine with just a piece of wire and a prayer. Silas listened, his blue eyes never leaving her face, and for the first time, sharing her memories felt less like opening a wound and more like honoring a legacy. The town, however, was not so quiet. Whispers followed Ellie when she went to the general store for supplies. They saw a widow, vulnerable and alone, taking in a nameless drifter. They saw scandal, not survival. Mr. Gable, the banker, made a special trip out to her farm. He didn't get out of his shiny black automobile, just rolled down the window, a smug look on his face. "Vance," he said, not even bothering to use her first name. "A word of advice. The county sheriff doesn't take kindly to vagrants. You'd be wise to get rid of your hired hand. It doesn't look proper." He glanced over at Silas, who was methodically resetting a corner post, his expression one of pure dismissal. Silas didn't even look up, just continued his work, his steady movements a silent rebuke to the banker's intrusion. The implied threat was clear. Ellie was already an outcast. Harboring a stranger made her a target. "He is my guest," Ellie said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "And he is a better man than you will ever be." Gable just laughed, a short, ugly sound, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust to settle on Ellie's defiance. The day of the foreclosure auction arrived under a clear, unforgiving sky. Ellie had done all she could. The house was tidy, the remaining windows covered with boards, the salvaged remnants of her life packed into boxes. Silas had disappeared at dawn without a word, and a cold dread filled Ellie's heart. She thought maybe Gable's threats had worked. Maybe he had finally realized what a lost cause she was and had simply moved on. She stood on her battered porch, wearing her best Sunday dress, the same one she'd worn to John's funeral. The townspeople gathered in her yard, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and feigned sympathy. Mr. Gable stood at the front, clipboard in hand, looking like a vulture ready to feast. He started the proceedings, his voice booming with false authority as he listed the assets of the Vance farm. He started the bidding low. A few local farmers made half-hearted offers, more out of custom than real interest. The price crept up slowly. Ellie closed her eyes, preparing for the final, gut-wrenching moment when the gavel would fall and her home would belong to someone else. "Sold to," Gable began, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "Hold on." The voice cut through the crowd, deep and steady, came from the back. The crowd parted, and Ellie's eyes flew open. It was Silas, but not the Silas she knew. The dirt and grime were gone. He was clean-shaven, wearing a crisp white shirt, clean denim, and boots that shone in the sun. He walked with a slight limp, but with an air of authority that silenced the murmuring crowd. Beside him was a man in a tailored city suit carrying a briefcase. "I don't believe you've registered to bid," Gable sneered, clearly flustered. "The name is Blackwood," Silas said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "Silas Blackwood. And I believe my credit is good in this county." A gasp rippled through the onlookers. The name Blackwood was legend in this part of the state. It was a name associated with the vast, sprawling Blackwood ranches, an empire of cattle and land that stretched across 3 counties. Mr. Gable's face went from pink to ghost white. "Blackwood?" he stammered. "As in?" "That's right," Silas said, his gaze as hard as granite. He turned to the auctioneer. "I bid 5 times the current offer." The crowd fell silent. No one could match it. It was a king's ransom for a broken-down farm. "Sold," the auctioneer stammered, banging his gavel. "To Mr. Silas Blackwood." Silas walked through the stunned crowd directly to the porch where Ellie stood, frozen in disbelief. His lawyer stepped forward and handed a check to the dumbfounded Mr. Gable. Silas ignored him completely. He took a document from his lawyer and held it out to Ellie. It was the deed to the farm. Her name was the only one on it, marked "Paid in Full." "I believe this belongs to you," Silas said softly, his blue eyes losing their hard edge, becoming the kind eyes she knew. I don't understand," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she took the paper. "You helped me when I was just a stranger with a bloody leg," he explained, his voice low so only she could hear. "You offered me shelter from the storm, sharing the little you had, never asking for anything in return. My father always told me you can judge a person's character not by how they treat their equals, but by how they treat those who can do nothing for them. You, Eleanor Vance, have more wealth in your heart than any man I've ever known." Then, he turned to face the townspeople and Mr. Gable. His voice rose again, clear and strong. "Let it be known," he announced, "that this farm and Mrs. Vance are under the protection of Blackwood Ranches. And as for the Harmony Creek Bank—" He paused, letting his gaze fall directly on the sweating, terrified Mr. Gable. My business manager will be in tomorrow morning to close all of our accounts. We prefer to do business with men of character. The collective gasp from the crowd was louder this time. He had not just saved her. He had delivered a justice so swift and complete it left everyone breathless. He had dismantled Mr. Gable's petty kingdom with a few simple words. As the townspeople dispersed in shocked silence, Ellie looked from the deed in her hand to the man standing before her. He was no longer a drifter, a hired hand, or a stranger. He was the man who had seen her, truly seen her, not as a pitiful widow, but as a woman of pride and courage. In the middle of the wreckage of her old life, under a wide open sky, a new life was beginning. It was a life built not on a foundation of wood and nails, but on an act of kindness in the heart of a tornado. The dust from Mr. Gable's hasty departure had barely settled when the last of the curious townspeople shuffled away, their whispers trailing behind them like smoke. In the sudden quiet, the world seemed to hold its breath. All Ellie could hear was the frantic beating of her own heart and the crinkle of the deed in her hand. The paper felt impossibly heavy, a weight of gratitude so immense it threatened to crush her. She looked up at Silas Blackwood, and for the first time, she truly saw the man, not the drifter. The easy confidence, the quiet authority she had mistaken for simple self-reliance, now clicked into place. He wasn't just a kind stranger. He was a force of nature, just like the tornado that had brought him to her. And it terrified her as much as it filled her with a dizzying sense of relief. She felt a chasm open between them, a canyon carved by money and power that hadn't been there when they were just two survivors huddled in a cellar. "I don't know what to say," she finally managed, her voice a reedy whisper. "Thank you seems too small a word." Silas's gaze softened, the hard edge of the powerful rancher melting away, leaving behind the man who had patiently listened to her stories about John. "You don't have to say anything, Ellie," he said, his voice the same low baritone that had calmed her in the dark. "You ran into a storm for me. You gave me shelter when you had nothing. A piece of paper and a few dollars is a poor trade for that kind of courage. But it wasn't just a few dollars. It was a fortune. It was her life." The words felt wrong in her mouth, like a debt she could never repay. Her pride, that stubborn, thorny thing that had been her only shield for so long, pricked at her. She wasn't a charity case. "But this is too much," she insisted, looking from the deed to his face. "I can't accept this." He took a step closer, his presence commanding yet gentle. "This isn't a gift, Ellie. It's an investment. I'm investing in good character. It's the rarest commodity in the world, and you have more of it than anyone I've ever met." His words were a balm on the raw wound of her pride. He wasn't giving her a handout. He was honoring her strength. He saw her not as someone to be pitied, but as someone to be admired. In that moment, the canyon between them didn't seem so wide. The next day, the change was palpable. When Ellie walked into the general store, the very same people who had once looked through her now rushed to greet her. Mrs. Gable, the banker's cousin and the town's chief gossip, practically tripped over herself to help Ellie with her basket. "Oh, Eleanor, dear. So good to see you. We were all so worried after the storm. Is there anything at all you need? Just put it on your account." Ellie knew she didn't have an account. It was a privilege reserved for those who weren't on the verge of foreclosure. The hypocrisy was so thick she could barely breathe. She saw it in their eyes, a greedy, calculating light. They weren't seeing her. They were seeing Silas Blackwood's influence standing behind her. With a polite but firm "No, thank you, I'll be paying cash," she placed her coins on the counter, gathered her meager supplies, and walked out, her head held high. The whispers followed her out the door, a different tune this time, full of awe and envy, but they were still whispers. She realized that Silas had saved her from one kind of judgment only to expose her to another. She returned to the farm to find a sight that made her stop in her tracks. A large truck with the Blackwood Ranch brand on the door was parked in her yard, and a crew of 4 men were already on her roof, their hammers ringing out in a steady, reassuring rhythm. Silas was directing them, pointing out a weak joist. He saw her and walked over, a small smile on his face. I hope you don't mind, he said. My foreman and his crew had a free morning. They're the best builders in the county. Ellie looked from the men to Silas, her heart a tangle of gratitude and unease. You have to stop doing this, she said, her voice strained. You've done more than enough. I can't let you rebuild my life for me. Silas's smile faded. He looked at her, his blue eyes searching her face. Is that what you think I'm doing? He asked quietly. I'm not trying to take over, Ellie. I'm just lending a hand, like you did. This is what neighbors do. We're not neighbors, Silas, she said, the words hurting her more than him. You live in a different world. He was silent for a long moment, the sound of the hammers filling the space between them. Maybe, he finally said, but it's a lonely world, Ellie. It's full of people like the ones in that store. People who want something from Silas Blackwood. For a few days, here with you, I wasn't Blackwood. I was just Silas, a man with a bad leg who needed help. You gave me that. You reminded me of what's real. His honesty disarmed her. He was right. In the cellar, they had been equals. In the quiet evenings, they had been equals. The money didn't change the truth of what had passed between them. All right, she conceded, a small smile touching her own lips. But I'm making lunch, and your men will eat a proper meal, not just sandwiches. For the first time since the storm, Ellie felt a genuine lightness in her chest. She spent the rest of the day cooking, filling the damaged house with the smell of fried chicken and baking bread. She worked alongside the men, handing them tools, bringing them water, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. She was not a damsel in distress. She was the mistress of this farm, seeing to its restoration. That evening, after the crew had left and the new roof stood strong and solid against the sunset, Silas found her by the pasture fence, watching her old milk cow graze. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of freshly cut pine. The house is secure now, he said, coming to stand beside her. It'll keep the rain out. Thank you, she said. And this time the words felt right. They felt adequate. I have to head back to the main ranch tomorrow, he said, his voice tinged with a reluctance she felt in her own heart. There are things that need my attention. A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air crept over her. Of course he had to leave. His world was out there, vast and demanding. Her world was here on these 30 acres. I understand, she said, keeping her eyes fixed on the horizon. But I'll be back, he added quickly, turning to face her. I'd like to come back, Ellie, if you'll have me. She finally turned to look at him. The setting sun cast his face in gold and shadow. He was no longer just the owner of half the county. He was Silas, a man with kind eyes and a quiet strength, a man who had seen her at her lowest and had not looked away. He had given her back her home. But more than that, he had given her back a belief in goodness, a belief in the future. I'll be here, she said, her voice steady and clear. It was not a promise made by a grateful woman to her benefactor. It was a promise made between two equals, two survivors who had found something rare and unexpected in the heart of a storm. As he rode away the next morning, a lone figure growing smaller against the vast plains, Ellie did not feel alone. She stood on the porch of her own house, under her own roof, and felt the solid ground beneath her feet. The storm had passed, and the work of rebuilding had just begun. The silence Silas left behind was heavier than the one she had known before. In the lonely months after John's passing, the quiet had been a hollow ache, the sound of absence. This new silence was different. It was filled with the echo of his voice, the memory of his steady presence, and the quiet hum of anticipation. Ellie stood on her porch, now solid and secure beneath her feet, and looked out at the monumental task ahead. The new roof was a crown on a broken kingdom. The fields were littered with debris, the skeleton of the barn a constant, painful reminder of all she had lost. For a day, she allowed herself to simply drift, to feel the phantom weight of his companionship and the sharp sting of its removal. But Ellie Vance was not a woman built for drifting. Her hands, calloused from a life of work, itched for a purpose. John had always said that idle hands were the devil's workshop, but Ellie knew they were simply a path to despair. On the second morning, she woke with a renewed, steely resolve. Silas had given her a foundation, a shield, but she would be the one to rebuild the house. She went to the splintered remains of the barn and began the painstaking work of salvage. She pulled nails, one by one, from broken timbers, her hammer tapping out a steady rhythm against the morning quiet. She stacked the usable lumber, her muscles protesting at first, then settling into the familiar burn of honest labor. She found John's old toolbox, miraculously spared, lying beneath a pile of hay. Opening it was like opening a memory. The scent of oil and sawdust, the worn wooden handle of his favorite hammer, the neat rows of screws he had always kept sorted. Tucked inside a leather pouch was a small, dog-eared notebook. She opened it, and her breath caught in her throat. It was John's handwriting, sketching out his dreams for the farm. A plan for a new, larger chicken coop with a fenced-in run, notes on crop rotation, a rough drawing for an irrigation ditch from the creek. Tears welled in her eyes, not of grief, but of profound connection. He wasn't just a memory, he was a blueprint. Her work did not go unnoticed. Sheriff Brody's car kicked up dust on her road a week after Silas had left. He was a big man who filled his uniform, with a slow way of talking that made people underestimate his shrewdness. He tipped his hat as he got out of the car. "Morning, Ellie," he said, his eyes sweeping over the new roof, the neat piles of salvaged lumber, and Ellie herself, her dress smudged with dirt. "Just doing my rounds. Making sure you're all right out here on your own." Ellie knew it was more than a social call. He was the law, but he was also a man who understood the intricate power dynamics of the county. He was here to gauge the situation, to see just how strong Silas Blackwood's protection really was. "I'm quite all right, Sheriff. Just busy," she replied, her voice even. She didn't stop her work, just leaned on a pile of wood, meeting his gaze directly. "Heard you had some excitement at the auction," he prodded, feigning casual interest. "Silas Blackwood. He doesn't come down this way often. Must have taken a real interest in your property." "He's a good man," Ellie said simply, leaving no room for gossip or speculation. "He saw someone in trouble and he helped." Sheriff Brody nodded slowly, a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, in his eyes. "Well, you let me know if anyone gives you any trouble. Anyone at all." He tipped his hat again and drove off. The message was clear. The law was on her side now, not because it was just, but because it was prudent. The protection held. But there were other, subtler battles to be fought. Mr. Gable, stripped of his public power, had resorted to the coward's weapon: poison. A new rumor began to circulate, a foul whisper that slithered through the general store and the church pews. It painted Ellie not as a survivor, but as a cunning opportunist. A black widow who had somehow ensnared the county's wealthiest bachelor. They said she'd planned it, that she'd trapped him, that her quiet dignity was a clever performance. The first time she heard it, it was from the hushed conversation of two women who fell silent as she rounded the aisle in the store. The shame and anger burned in her cheeks. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, to tell them about the terror of the storm and the simple human kindness that had forged her bond with Silas. But she did what she had always done. She held her head high, paid for her flour and salt, and walked out into the sunlight, her pride a fragile shield against their venom. She knew that any protest would only feed the fire. The only way to fight a lie was with the truth of her own character. An opportunity came a few days later. Martha, the wife of a farmer on the neighboring property who had always been curt and dismissive, found herself in a bind. Her husband had broken his leg, and with 3 young children and a field of crops to manage, she was overwhelmed. Ellie saw her in the yard, trying to wrestle a heavy feed sack from her wagon, her face a mask of exhaustion and despair. The old Ellie, the one who had been wounded by Martha's coldness, might have turned away. But the woman Silas had invested in, the woman John had loved, did not. She walked across the field, her shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun. "Looks like you could use a hand," Ellie said, her voice calm and free of judgment. Martha looked up, startled. Her eyes filled with suspicion and shame. "I'm fine," she muttered. Ellie ignored her protest and grabbed one side of the heavy sack. "Two is better than one," she said. Together, they heaved it into the barn. For the rest of the afternoon, Ellie worked alongside her, feeding the animals, mending a fence, helping with the children. They didn't speak much, but in the shared language of hard work, a quiet understanding began to form. As the sun began to set, Martha finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "Why?" she asked. "I've never been kind to you." Ellie looked at the woman, seeing not an enemy, but another soul struggling against the harsh realities of their world. "Because it's what neighbors do," she said, echoing the words Silas had spoken to her. A week later, a rider bearing the Blackwood brand came up her road. He was a young, respectful man who dismounted and handed her a thick envelope. "From Mr. Blackwood, ma'am," he said, before tipping his hat and riding off. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside wasn't money or a grand gesture. It was a letter, written in a strong, clear hand. He wrote that his business was almost concluded. He asked about the cow, about the progress on the farm. Then he wrote a line that made her heart ache with a sweet, unfamiliar pang. "You told me John planned to build a new coop. I found these old schematics for a sturdy design that holds up well in high winds. I thought they might be useful." Folded inside the letter were detailed architectural drawings. It was the most thoughtful, most considerate gift she had ever received. He had listened. He had remembered. He hadn't tried to solve her problems with his wealth, but had offered his knowledge, respecting her ability to do the work herself. He saw her not as a project to be fixed, but as a partner in rebuilding. That night, Ellie sat at her small kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm glow on the two sets of plans before her. John's heartfelt, rustic sketch and Silas's practical, engineered design. One was the dream of her past, the other a promise for her future. She realized, with a clarity that settled deep in her soul, that she didn't have to choose between them. She could honor the man she had lost while building a life with the man she was beginning to find. She took a clean sheet of paper and, using John's vision and Silas's expertise, began to draw a plan of her own. She was no longer just surviving the aftermath. She was designing her future, timber by timber, nail by nail. The wind outside whispered through the newly patched eaves of her house, but for the first time, it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a promise. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of labor and ink. By day, Ellie was a carpenter, a farmer, a force of will against the lingering chaos. She laid the foundation for the new chicken coop herself, using John's clever design for the footings and Silas's specifications for the dimensions. Her hands, already calloused, grew tougher, her arms stronger. The work was grueling, but it was honest, and with every nail she hammered, she was driving out the last ghosts of helplessness. She was not just rebuilding a structure. She was reclaiming her life from the storm. The letters from Silas became her evening ritual. She would wash the day's dirt and sweat from her skin and then, by the warm glow of the kerosene lamp, she would read his words and write her own. Their correspondence deepened, peeling back the layers of circumstance that had defined their first meeting. He wrote not of his wealth or his vast properties, but of the crushing loneliness that often accompanied them. He described long days in the saddle, board meetings with men who saw him only as a name on a deed, and silent dinners in a grand dining room built for a family he never had. He confessed that her letters, filled with descriptions of her progress on the coop or the stubborn persistence of a particular weed, were the most real part of his week. In return, Ellie found herself opening up in ways she never had before. She wrote about her fears, not just of the bank or the storm, but of the quiet, creeping fear of being forgotten. She told him how John's plans had given her a purpose, and how his plans had given her the confidence to see it through. They were building something, not just with lumber and nails, but with shared words and vulnerabilities, a connection that spanned the miles between her small, healing farm and his vast, empty ranch. The shift in the town's opinion began not with a grand announcement, but with a quiet act of loyalty. It started with Martha. One afternoon, while Ellie was buying seeds, she overheard Mr. Gable's cousin whispering the now familiar, poisonous rumor to a newcomer. Before Ellie could even stiffen her spine to ignore it, Martha stepped forward, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "That's a lie," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the store's quiet hum. "I've seen Eleanor Vance work with her own 2 hands from sunup to sundown to save what's hers. And I saw her walk across a field to help a neighbor who had never shown her a lick of kindness. That's not the work of an opportunist. That's the work of a good woman." The cousin flushed a deep, mottled red and scurried away. A seed of truth had been planted, and in the fertile ground of a small town, it began to grow. Soon other women, emboldened by Martha's stand, would offer a kind word. A farmer offered Ellie the use of his wagon. The community, which had once judged her from a distance, was slowly beginning to see the woman Silas Blackwood had seen all along. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, Ellie was fitting the last rafter onto the coop's roof. She was exhausted, covered in sawdust, but a deep, powerful sense of satisfaction warmed her from the inside out. The structure was sound, her own design brought to life through her own labor. She heard the soft thud of horse hooves on the dirt road, a familiar sound that made her heart leap into her throat. It wasn't a messenger. It was Silas. He sat atop a handsome bay horse, looking not like the owner of half the county, but simply like a man who had come home. He didn't say a word at first, just dismounted and let his gaze travel over the nearly finished coop, the tidy yard, and finally, to her. The look in his eyes was worth more than all the deeds in the world. It was a look of pure, unadulterated admiration. "You did this," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "I sent you a drawing, and you built a fortress." "I had a good set of plans," she said, a smile touching her lips as she climbed down the ladder. "2, actually." They stood in the fading light, the space between them charged with all the words they had written and all the feelings they had left unsaid. "I read your last letter a dozen times," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "About how you were starting to feel at home again. I realized I haven't felt at home in years. The ranch is just a place I live, Ellie. It's not a home." He took a step closer, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "My business was finished weeks ago. I stayed away because I was afraid." "Afraid?" she asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Afraid of what?" "That what I felt was just gratitude on your part, and pity on mine," he admitted, his honesty a raw, beautiful thing. "I was afraid that the man who owned half the county would get in the way of the man who sat with you in the cellar. But reading your letters, I realized I was a fool. I wasn't falling for a victim of a storm. I was falling for the woman who fought it and was building a new life from the wreckage." Her breath hitched. He closed the remaining distance between them, gently taking her rough, work-worn hands in his. "I don't want to just be your protector, Ellie. I want to be your partner. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears she didn't know she was holding back welled in her eyes. They weren't tears of sorrow or relief, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. For so long, her life had been about holding on, about surviving. In his eyes, she saw the promise of not just surviving, but thriving. "Yes," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of her past and the hope of her entire future. "Yes, Silas." He smiled, a genuine, soul-deep smile that transformed his rugged face. He didn't kiss her then. Instead, he raised her hands to his lips and gently kissed her knuckles, a gesture of respect so tender and profound it sealed the promise between them. The storm had taken everything, but in its wake, it had cleared a path. Standing there, between the patched-up house and the new coop she had built with her own 2 hands, Ellie Vance knew she was finally on solid ground, ready to build a future she had never dared to dream of. Part 6. The sun rose the next morning on a world that felt both entirely new and deeply familiar. Ellie woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of a steady, rhythmic hammering from outside. She found Silas on the porch, a cup of coffee steaming beside him, mending the very step he had eaten his first meal on. He wasn't dressed in the crisp, clean clothes of Silas Blackwood, the rancher. He wore the same durable denim he'd worn when he was just her mysterious hired hand, a smudge of dirt already on his cheek. He looked up as she opened the door, and the smile that reached his eyes was more welcoming than any sunrise. "Morning," he said, his voice a low, comfortable rumble. "The third board was loose. Figured I'd fix it before you tripped and spilled my coffee." There was an easy domesticity to the scene that felt both startling and profoundly right. He hadn't just proposed a life together. He had already started living it. He poured her a cup of coffee, and they sat together in the cool morning air, not as a wealthy landowner and the woman he'd rescued, but as two people with a day's work ahead of them. "What's the plan for today, boss?" he asked, taking a sip of his coffee, his eyes twinkling. The question was a gift. He was ceding control, making it clear that this was her land, her home, and he was here to be her partner, not her proprietor. A warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Well," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face, "that coupe isn't going to paint itself. And I have a feeling you know your way around a paintbrush." "Yes, ma'am," he said with a mock salute. "I believe I can handle that." They worked side by side all day, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. They painted the new coupe a brilliant, hopeful barn red, their hands brushing occasionally, sending small jolts of electricity through Ellie's veins. They spoke of simple things, the best way to thin paint, the stubbornness of a particular horse he owned, the way the light hit the valley in the late afternoon. It was in these simple moments that their future felt most real. They were not just two people in love. They were two people who knew how to work, how to build, how to create something tangible and lasting from the ground up. Late in the afternoon, a familiar black automobile rumbled up the road, moving with a hesitant, uncertain energy. Mr. Gable got out, looking smaller and older than Ellie remembered. His suit was rumpled, his face pale and drawn. He stood by his car, twisting his hat in his hands, a man utterly stripped of his former arrogance. Silas stopped painting, his body tensing, but Ellie laid a calming hand on his arm. "I'll handle this," she said softly. She walked toward the banker, wiping her paint-stained hands on a rag. She felt no fear, no anger, only a distant sort of pity. "Mr. Gable," she said, her voice steady, "what can I do for you?" He stammered, his eyes darting from her to Silas and back again. "Mrs. Vance, Eleanor, I came to apologize. My actions, they were unbecoming. I was just following the bank's policies, you understand." He was pleading, his desperation plain. "I was hoping, perhaps, that you might speak to Mr. Blackwood on my behalf. His withdrawal of the ranch's accounts has caused significant difficulties." Ellie looked at the man who had tried to ruin her, who had looked at her grief as an inconvenience. She could have savored his humiliation. She could have reminded him of his cruelty. But she thought of the woman Silas had seen, the woman with a wealth of character in her heart. "Mr. Gable," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "what passes between you and Mr. Blackwood is your business, just as my farm was my business. My only concern now is this farm, and the work that needs to be done on it." She offered no condemnation, but also no absolution. She simply dismissed him and his world, turning her back on the petty power games he had played. She was no longer a piece on his board. With a final, defeated glance, Mr. Gable got back in his car and drove away, disappearing in a cloud of dust that settled back into irrelevance. When she returned to the coupe, Silas was watching her, his expression one of profound love and respect. "My father always said the greatest victory is the one you win without ever raising your voice," he said quietly. "You, Eleanor Vance, are victorious." That evening, as the stars began to blanket the sky, they sat on the newly repaired porch. Silas brought out a large, rolled-up sheet of paper. It wasn't a deed or a legal document. It was a topographical map of the entire region. On it, the vast Blackwood ranches were shaded in green, and her own small 30 acres were marked in a neat, red square. They looked like two different worlds. "I've been thinking," he said, tracing a line with his finger. "My ranch has land, more land than any one person needs, but it's not a home. This," he tapped the small red square, "this is a home, because you're here." He then unrolled another, smaller schematic. It was a beautifully drawn plan for a house, a ranch house, sturdy and elegant, with a wide, welcoming porch. "There's a ridge right here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map that straddled the border between their properties. "It overlooks your creek and my best grazing pasture. I thought we could build something, not on my land or on your land, but on land that is ours." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "We could build a new home, Ellie, together. A place where the Blackwood Ranch and the Vance farm meet." Ellie looked from the map to his face and saw her future laid out before her. It wasn't a story of a poor widow being rescued by a wealthy rancher. It was a story of two strong, capable people choosing to build a new world together. The tornado had been a storm of destruction, but it had swept their lives clean, leaving only what was essential. And here, in the quiet of the evening, with the scent of new paint in the air and a shared dream sketched out on paper, they were beginning to build their foundation. The first light of dawn found them not on the porch, but on horseback, riding toward the ridge that separated their two worlds. The air was crisp, scented with sagebrush and damp earth. Ellie rode John's old, steady mare, while Silas was on his powerful bay. They rode in a comfortable silence, the quiet rhythm of the hooves a conversation in itself. As they ascended the gentle slope, the landscape unfolded below them. To one side lay the Blackwood lands, a vast, rolling sea of green and gold pasture dotted with cattle that looked like tiny specks in the distance. To the other lay the Vance farm, small and defiant, its new red coop a bright beacon of resilience, the creek a silver ribbon winding through the cottonwoods. They dismounted at the crest of the ridge. A lone, ancient oak tree stood there, its branches reaching like open arms toward both properties. This was the place Silas had marked on the map, the place that belonged to neither and to both. The view was breathtaking. It was a panorama of their pasts and a canvas for their future. "John and I used to walk up here sometimes," Ellie said softly, her voice carried on the morning breeze. "He said from here you could see forever." She wasn't speaking with sadness, but with a quiet reverence, a way of introducing the man she had loved to the man she was learning to love. Silas didn't flinch or look away. He simply stood beside her, his presence solid and reassuring, and looked out at the view as if trying to see it through John's eyes. "He was right," Silas said after a moment. "It's a good place to see forever from." He understood. He wasn't trying to erase her past, but to become a part of her future. As they stood there, a small wagon appeared on the road leading to Ellie's farm. It was Martha, her husband sitting beside her, his bandaged leg propped up. They watched as Martha got out, carrying a large, cloth-covered basket, and walked up to the farmhouse door. She looked around, then spotted them on the ridge and, with a smile, waved. Ellie waved back, her heart swelling with a warmth that rivaled the morning sun. The news had traveled, not as a salacious rumor this time, but as a hopeful story passed from one neighbor to another. This was not the town coming to gawk at the wealthy rancher's new prize. This was a neighbor bringing a welcome gift. The town was beginning to heal, and she was a part of it. "We should get started," Silas said, rolling up his sleeves. He hadn't brought a crew of men or heavy equipment. He had brought 2 axes, a shovel, and a length of twine. "Foundation comes first," he said with a grin. "And before the foundation comes the clearing." They spent the rest of the day working under the shade of the old oak tree. It was hard, physical work. Silas swung the axe with a powerful, practiced ease, felling the stubborn sagebrush, while Ellie followed with the shovel, clearing the roots and stones, her intimate knowledge of the soil guiding her. They worked as a seamless team, their individual strengths complementing each other perfectly. He was the raw power. She was the thoughtful precision. They were learning the rhythm of each other's labor, a dance more intimate than any waltz. By late afternoon, they had cleared a large, level square of earth. It was a tangible beginning, a patch of ground claimed by their shared effort. They were both streaked with sweat and dirt, their muscles aching, but as they stood back to look at their work, a shared sense of profound accomplishment settled over them. This was not a house he was giving her. This was a home they were creating from the very soil that connected them. Later, as the sky turned a soft, dusky rose, they sat beneath the oak tree, sharing the bread and cheese Martha had left in the basket. The silence was filled with the contentment of a day well spent. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It wasn't a ring or a piece of jewelry. It was an old, tarnished brass compass. "This was my grandfather's," he said, placing it in her palm. It was heavy and cool. "He was the first Blackwood to settle this land. He said a man can own all the land in the world, but he'll still be lost if he doesn't know which way is home." He gently closed her fingers around it. "My home is wherever you are, Ellie." Ellie looked down at the compass. The needle quivered for a moment before settling, pointing steadfastly north. She looked up at Silas, his face illuminated by the last golden rays of sunlight, and she knew the compass was right. For the first time in a very long time, she was no longer just surviving. She was heading home. The building of the house on the ridge became the story of the season. It began with just the two of them, their solitary efforts a testament to their shared resolve. But soon, a new sound joined their hammering, the rumble of a wagon. It was Martha's husband, his leg now healed enough for light work, a sawhorse and toolbox in the back of his cart. "A man can't build a house alone," he'd said gruffly, a deep respect in his eyes that had never been there before. He was the first, but he was not the last. The next day, 2 more farmers from down the valley arrived, their initial awe of Silas Blackwood quickly giving way to the easy camaraderie of men who understand the language of lumber and sweat. It was a quiet miracle, unfolding day by day. The town that had once whispered behind Ellie's back was now working at her side. The women would bring lunches, spreading blankets under the shade of the old oak tree, their chatter and laughter a stark contrast to the venomous gossip of the past. They didn't come because they were afraid of Silas's power. They came because they were inspired by Ellie's strength. They had seen her face ruin with dignity, and they had seen her extend kindness where none was deserved. In rebuilding her life, she had, without ever intending to, helped the community rebuild a piece of its own soul. The day the walls were raised was a celebration. It was a house-raising in the truest sense, a collective effort of neighbors pushing against the weight of the timber frames, their unified grunts and shouts of prayer against the sky. As the final wall locked into place, a cheer went up. Ellie stood beside Silas, her hand in his, and looked at the skeleton of their future. A structure built not just of pine and nails, but of forgiveness and community. They decided to be married right there, on the subfloor of the new house, with the open sky for a ceiling and the frame of their future life as their chapel. It was a simple affair. Ellie wore a plain blue dress, the color of a clear sky after a storm. Silas wore the clean, simple clothes of a rancher, not a magnate. Their guests were the people who had stood by them. Martha and her family, the farmers who had helped them build, and Sheriff Brody, who stood beside Silas as his witness. The traveling preacher who served the county spoke not of riches or status, but of the strength found in shelter, and the grace found in offering it to a stranger. As he spoke, Ellie clutched the brass compass in her hand, its solid weight a silent reminder of her true north. After the vows were exchanged, and Silas kissed her with a tenderness that promised a lifetime of gentle strength, they walked to the newly framed hearth. Waiting there was a small box Ellie had packed that morning. From it, she took the silver-framed photograph of her and John, their faces young and full of dreams. With a deep breath, she placed it on the rough-hewn mantelpiece. It was not an act of clinging to the past, but of honoring the journey that had brought her here. She felt Silas's hand on her shoulder, a gesture of pure, unconditional support. He understood that love does not erase love. It simply makes more room in the heart. The seasons turned. The house was finished, its windows looking out over the joined lands, its porch wide and welcoming. The Blackwood Ranch and the Vance farm were no longer separate entities on a map. They were simply home. On a cool autumn evening, a year after the tornado, Ellie and Silas sat on their porch swing, a fire crackling in the hearth inside. The land before them was peaceful, the cattle grazing on his side of the valley, the lights of her restored farmhouse twinkling on the other. The two worlds were one, viewed from a bridge of their own making. Silas took her hand, his thumb tracing circles over her knuckles. "Are you happy, Ellie?" he asked, his voice a soft murmur in the twilight. Ellie looked at the home they had built, at the land that held her history and her future, and at the man beside her who had seen her at her most broken and loved her for her strength. She thought of the terror of the storm, the cruelty of the bank, the loneliness of her grief. They were all just stories now, the faded prologue to a much better book. She opened her palm. In it lay the old brass compass. The needle was still pointing north, unwavering and true. "I'm home, Silas," she said, her voice filled with a peace she had once thought was lost forever. "I'm finally home." And as the first star appeared in the vast, quiet sky, they sat together, two survivors who had found in the heart of the wreckage not just shelter, but the rarest of all treasures, a place to belong.